those members of our school community who are listening to this adult education course, which we have every Sunday morning. And I want to talk about the Haggadah and just review with those of you who come every Sunday what I've done. First of all, in the Torah, as we look at the material, remember, the Torah in its mandate regarding Pesach is primarily, as I tried to show you, actions, very little narrative. There's a little narrative added in the book of Deuteronomy. There's a small bit of narrative, when your children shall ask you the meaning of Pesach. And by the way, I'm not going to talk about that today, but it always occurs to me that when you say when your children will ask you about Pesach, it's kind of nervous. It's a kind of nervous. In other words, lest your children ask you regarding Pesach, they won't know what it's all about. So there's a kind of tension in the Haggadah between telling a story and people not remembering what the story is. But that's another subject for another time. But there's very little narrative in the Haggadah, in the Torah, and there's a lot of action. The action is sacrificing the Paschal lamb, eating the matzah, eating the maror, and that's basically where the Torah comes from. And I tried to suggest to you when we started that there were clearly two different celebrations: Chag HaPesach, the holiday of the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb; Chag HaMatzot, the holiday of Matzot. The two were fused together. They came from different environments. They were fused, and the historical narrative was added on to that about the Exodus from Egypt. That's how the Torah commands it, and it's pretty clear that's what's happening in the Torah. The second stage I did more recently with you was we studied the Mishnah. We studied the Mishnah of Pesachim, of Pesach, and I showed you how the Mishnah on Pesach, which gives us all the rest of the details, was written after the destruction of the temple, not during the destruction, which is very critical, not prior. So that the Chag HaPesach, the observing the Paschal lamb, which was the centerpiece, the matzah was secondary, that had to somehow be replaced because they didn't do it anymore. They did it in the wilderness, in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. They did it in the temple, which was destroyed in the year 70. But the Mishnah, which derives all this in the Haggadah, or most of it, was written in between 135 and 170 CE, after the temple was destroyed. So the Mishnah starts creating two things. Number one, new actions to supplement the ones that weren't there anymore. That's really what it does. Charoset, 4 cups of wine, all those things are new actions, not in the Torah. And number two, starts to give a narrative, which is a little bit in the Torah, but it starts to drag it out and amplify on it. That's why you have in the Mishnah, remember, in the Mishnah, you have the Manishtana, the 4 questions. It's a little different than Mishnah about roast meat and all that, but that you start adding a narrative to supplement or replace, really, what was lost. Now, when we get to the Haggadah, what the Haggadah is doing, I see the Haggadah as a kind of structure around the original Pesach. In other words, it's like when you build a building and you build a scaffolding around it, right? The scaffolding on the side, and you fix it and all that. Now, I apologize to those who actually build buildings here, like my friend Ira, very important engineer here. He is.
No apologies.
He's too modest, Ira, but he's the chief engineer of all the construction at Sloan Kettering. All right? So you have the Haggadah is scaffolding around the observance of Pesach in the Torah and around the building in the Mishnah. But what happens is the scaffolding becomes the building. That's really what happens. So now that conceptually, that's what's happening. And let's talk a little bit about the Haggadah. Give you a little time to develop it, and then we'll take questions, and we will look in the Haggadah. And I hope it makes more sense to you after I finish and not less sense, okay? All right. The overriding principle of the Haggadah is in the narrative. We start, it says, Matchilim Bignai. You start with the lowest point in Jewish history in telling the story. And you finish with the highest point in Jewish history. That's the principle which is defined in the Jewish law about the Haggadah. So the question is, what is the lowest point in Jewish history? Yes?
I was the wandering Aramaic.
No, wait, no, that's one version. That's one, no, that's not that you're correct. That's the problem. What was the lowest point in Jewish history?
Slavery.
So in the Talmud, there's a discussion. Well, listen, what was the bad part? And it's like, this is a narrative of a family. It's telling the story. So take your sheets and let's look at what the structure. You should have this sheet in front of you, which we passed out. I have one more if somebody wants it. All right, I thought I had enough. I'm sorry.
Does someone else need one?
Yes.
All right?
We'll share.
Please look at this sheet. Let's look at two things. The structure, and by the way, those of you who are watching from the school community, obviously you don't have the materials. I will be referring to the Haggadah, certain pages, and the materials. If you contact Michelle Rosenfeld, who has been wonderful in setting all this up, she will contact me and I'll get you the materials through her. Okay, so let's look please at this sheet. And let's look at two things. Number one, the structure of the Seder. Number two, what was the lowest point of Jewish history and how does that fit into the Seder? So let's look first at the structure. You have four parts to the Seder. This author calls them acts. They're very distinct. Act 1, I like to call a prologue. So look at what it is. Start with number 3. Lighting candles, Kiddush, washing the hands, you see it? First cup of wine, Kaddish. Urchatz, washing the hands. Karpas, which is the vegetable, the parsley. Yachatz, where you break the matzah. And Holach Ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction. Why is that the prologue? Because none of that is telling the degradation of the Jewish people. It's an introduction. The degradation of the Jewish people starts in the second part, which is called Magi, the telling of the story. So all that first part is like a prologue, up to the telling. So let's look now at the telling. Well, the question is, well, what was the worst part of the Jewish history? There are 4 versions, and they're all in the Haggadah. I am aware that when the story starts to be told, like you just said, 2 of the, it gets all confusing. Well, that's why I'm trying to break it up for you. The Talmud says, well, what was the worst part? So number 10, where it says number 10, we were slaves in Egypt. That's the most obvious, right? That's what the Torah says. The Torah says we were slaves in Egypt is the word. That's what it's talking about. Yeah.
No, David Moore said something very interesting.
Yes.
He defined this as not saying we were slaves in Egypt, but we were in the service of the Pharaoh.
Well, all right.
That changes the whole story.
Okay. That's correct. That David Moss, that's a nice understanding of it. Literally it says on page 9, I'll just translate it for you. Avadim ahinu l'Pharaoh b'Mitzrayim. We were enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. I mean, I see them as the same thing, but it does change the whole story. Let me leave David's understanding of it, because he's trying to fit it to his wonderful art, but I'm not. It says, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. So whether we were enslaved to Pharaoh or enslaved in Egypt, they're synonyms. They're synonyms. But anyway, so that's the worst thing, page 9 in your Haggadah. That's one version, right? The second version is under 11. Somebody in the Talmud says, no, that's not the worst thing that happened. The worst thing that happened is we were idol worshippers. It has nothing to do with being physical. So on page 11 in your Haggadah, page 11, you have under, let's see, I'm looking for, page 11, right. Page 11, line 8. See it? Line 8 in Hebrew. On the left side, 4 paragraphs down. Long ago, our forefathers were worshippers of idols. Now the Eternal is our God, and we worship Him. We started as idol worshippers. We were released, and now we worship God. So that's the second version. The worst thing that happened to the Jewish people was not being physical slaves, but idol worshippers. So that's version 2 in the Haggadah. Version 3 is the most complex on page 12. And that's what Arlene was referring to. Look at page 12. Look at page 12. The third version is what I call the backstory. Meaning, well, how did we get to Egypt? That was the worst part. The backstory to the enslavement. So look on page 12, and that's what Arlene was referring to. We'll talk about it. Second paragraph, you see it? Come and learn what Laban the Syrian tried to do to our father Jacob. While Pharaoh decreed only against the males, Laban decided to uproot everybody. For it is written, a Syrian, that's Laban, tried to destroy my father. So my father went down to Egypt to dwell there, became mighty, etc., etc., etc. Now that's a little bit different because it's the backstory how we got there. And number 2, what's very dramatic about this, I think, if you look at it seriously, is what in the world does Laban the Syrian have to do with Egypt? And the answer is nothing. The answer is that in the history of Israel, ancient Israel, not modern, ancient, 2 powers, as some of you know from Middle East history, ruled Israel, either Egypt or Syria, Mesopotamia. There was always a struggle in the Middle East, always, between Egypt and Syria. The Nile area and the Tigris-Euphrates. And even in modern history, and I don't know a lot about modern Middle Eastern history, but we had many years ago a professor here to receive a lecture. Some of you we had him twice. His name was Asher Susser, S-U-S-S-E-R. He teaches at Tel Aviv University, Middle Eastern history. And I happen to be watching a course that he's teaching now on the origins of the Mideast. Israel's only a part. And he's talking about the modernization of Turkey, not with Ataturk, in the 19th century earlier. And one of the struggles in the breakup of the Ottoman Empire were the Turks for 400 years, prior to the First World War. And it was an Islamic empire, it weren't countries. But there was a tension, he points out, always between, in the modernization of Turkey in the 19th century, of the Middle East, Turkey, Egypt, they were in tension all the time as Muslim areas. And there was all kinds of rivalry. Now some of us may remember Sadat and other people. There was always this tension between the two. So let's go back to the Haggadah. The same thing in the ancient world. There was a tension between Syria and between Egypt.